The human mind, can it be controlled by someone else to perform acts against the will of the individual?
Shoot Bobby Raymond. Through the forehead.
Yes, ma'am.
Is control of the human being, such as the Manchurian Candidate, possible?
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. We are professing to tell you the complete story that we know. But these records that we've uncovered don't tell the story. They tell pieces of it.
This is a story that has been told in bits and pieces over the last few years. This is an attempt to pull most of it together. We know we don't have the full story. We do, however, have some striking new revelations and insights. It is a story of a concerted search by several United States intelligence agencies to perfect mind control. In 1953, at the height of the Cold War, President Eisenhower appointed Allen Dulles to be head of the CIA, the first peacetime intelligence agency in United States history. And as it had during OSS days, the search for mind control continued. As this 1952 CIA document shows, the aim at that time was controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. But it was a discovery here in Basel, Switzerland, at Sandoz Laboratories by Dr. Albert Hofmann, that led the intelligence agencies of America to believe that they had found the panacea. The discovery was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD.
It was one of the first times that anybody had run into a powerful drug that was different than anything else that they knew anything about.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA. This is the first time Gittinger has been interviewed publicly.
Could, in effect, disable a whole city by putting a very small amount on a water supply. Yeah.
It would not be long before the CIA and other intelligence agencies discovered that LSD was not only powerful, but dangerous. A former CIA official who worked on these programs did not wish to be filmed or recorded. The statements he made to ABC consultant John Marks will be read by someone else. They have been corroborated by ABC News. He tells what happened to one co-worker when LSD was put into his coffee in this Washington office building. The LSD took hold and he ran to the street, as illustrated here.
He sort of knew he had it, but he couldn't pull himself together, and it got away from him. He reported afterwards that every automobile that came by was a terrible monster with fantastic eyes, out to get him personally. It was a real horror trip for him. It was hours of agony. It was like a dream that never stops with someone chasing you. It was awfully hard to persuade him that his friends were his friends at that point. He was alone in the world, and everyone was hostile. He had become a full-blown paranoid.
The CIA's interest in LSD was intense. The worry was that the Russians would get hold of it. Were the Soviets into LSD?
I'm going to have to say I'm sure they were, but if you ask me to prove it, I've never seen any direct proof of it.
But at one point, intelligence information received from Switzerland said that Sandoz Laboratories was about to put 100 million doses of LSD on the open market. And it caused enough concern within the agency that the United States was prepared to buy the entire supply. However, a slight mistake had been made.
I just found out on a new CIA document that there were no such large quantities of LSD on the market.
Author John Marks has filed numerous Freedom of Information suits against the CIA and has unearthed much new material in this field. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a history of OSS and CIA work with mind control. He is also a consultant for this report.
What happened is that there was a military attaché in Switzerland, an American officer, who got milligrams and kilograms mixed up. In other words, he made a mistake of thinking 1/1000th of a gram was the same as 1,000 grams, which is a mistake of 1,000,000 times. So when the CIA got the intelligence that there were 100 million doses on the market, in fact, there were 100 doses.
The man who would oversee the CIA's research into drugs and most of the agency's behavior programs is this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview.
I recently received a document from the CIA which described Dr. Gottlieb's role in carrying LSD overseas during the early 1950s to slip to a foreign political leader just before he was supposed to give a speech. The hope was that the man would discredit himself in front of his followers. Dr. Gottlieb continued to personally carry drugs overseas for the CIA, all during the 50s and early 60s.
In their never-ending search for the miracle weapon, CIA operatives would search here in the remote mountain areas of southern Mexico for what up to then had been considered a myth, magic mushrooms. They would use this man, a part-time chemist for the CIA, to dupe this man, a vice president of a bank, and an amateur mycologist or mushroom expert, to try to get to the magic mushrooms and turn them into a drug.
They didn't know about it.
But it would be the amateur, R. Gordon Wasson and his colleagues, who would win the race.
That's no record left.
It would be Wasson who would discover the magic mushrooms were no myth.
We went into the Mazatec area, far from the highways, remote from Mexico City. There we found that rotten bagasse, as it's called, bagasso, covered with mushrooms. These mushrooms I didn't know, had never seen. They were the sacred mushrooms.
Wasson would also discover and record the ancient mystical rites of the mushrooms from a local shaman or magical priestess, Maria Sabina.
There we found her, and we found her daughter, Apollonia. They were delighted with the mushrooms, their freshness. They went into ecstasy. It was a thrilling night. Maria Sabina allocated to each one of us the mushrooms that we were to eat. Maria Sabina was silent, then she broke into humming, and then she began singing, and she sang for 4 hours. And we were seeing incredible sights. They would go slowly or they would go fast as I ordained. All your senses are rendered acute. We say that you see visions, you see hallucinations, but that doesn't begin to tell the story. The hallucinations are only part of it. You hear sound, you smell things. The night was thrilling.
This was the first known mushroom trip by outsiders, was it not?
The first known trip by outsiders. First known trip. There's nothing in any record.
Word of Wasson's discovery reached the CIA quickly.
Century.
Dr. James Moore, a chemist at the University of Delaware and secretly a full-service agent for the CIA, was a specialist in preparing deadly chemicals on short notice for the agency. Moore was instructed to contact Wasson and to pay to accompany him on another trip to Mexico to get the magic mushrooms. For as agency documents show, the CIA felt it's quite possible that a drug derived from the mushrooms could remain an agency secret. What in the world were they looking for with the magic mushrooms?
I think the best answer to that is that they were looking for fundamental information new information as fast as it became available. They wanted it as rapidly as it became available on compounds that would be capable of causing changes in behavior, changes in mental attitude.
But the CIA would be beaten to the punch on developing the magic mushrooms by Sandoz Laboratories. From the mushrooms, they derived psilocybin.
By the time I was in a position to do anything, Dr. Albert Hoffmann in Switzerland had isolated the principle, identified it, and synthesized it. Remarkably an excellent achievement.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you... I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. Your question again, what would I have thought had I known that
any of these substances would
have been given to
unwitting persons?
You mean a hostile agent of another government?
No, I
think that was probably one of the things they had in mind.
Testing it out on an American citizen.
I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic, because testing, given with advance warning, was pro forma at best and resulted in a false sense of accomplishment. A former CIA official who worked on these programs describes for the first time how the decision was made.
I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line. Every decent kid knows he shouldn't steal, but he does it sometimes. We knew damn well we didn't want anyone else to know what we were doing.
The decision was made to do testing on unwitting victims. Who would they be? It was decided they should be on the fringes of society because they were most vulnerable.
It was the borderline underworld, prostitutes, drug addicts, and other small-timers who would be powerless to seek any kind of revenge in case they found out.
And as their predecessors did a decade earlier, the CIA would turn to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official. And by this time, the stories about George White were legendary.
One day I was over to see George at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Leo Jones, a friend of White's who installed bugging equipment for him.
And there was George standing in front of a full-length mirror with a Derringer that he always carried as a second gun, which he had loaded with wax slugs and was sitting there shooting at his reflection in the mirror, having a general ball for himself.
Heavy drinker. He loved to drink. Mike started out with martinis. He used to start out with martinis. By supper time, he changed to straight whiskey. Then later on, he graduated to Gibson's. I figure he consumed at least half to three-quarters of a gallon of Gibson's a day.
That's a good drinker.
That's a good drinker.
He could hold his liquor. Very well, very well. The only thing you would ever tell about George if he was drinking, his speech became slightly slurred when he drank more than a quart.
By the time the waiter came over, he was really soused. So the waiter says, "May I help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. Paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder and said, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant. And I could have snuck under the table. I was so embarrassed by it.
George White did not mind bending the law, and he knew the street well. He was the ideal choice for what the CIA had in mind.
We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this, and he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs.
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
We did quite a study of prostitutes and their behavior. How do you take a woman who is willing to use her body to get money out of a guy to get him to talk about things which are much more important, like state secrets? To find a prostitute who's willing to stay is a hell of a shock. It's a boost to his ego. Most of the time, he gets pretty vulnerable. What the hell is he going to talk about? Not the sex. So he starts talking about his business. It's at that time she can lead him gently. But you have to train prostitutes to do that. We learned a lot about human nature in the bedroom. It wasn't what we had just thought of, you know, the missionary position. We started to pick up knowledge that could be used in operations.
There would be victims in all of this, but as the agency knew, they couldn't fight back. Some entries from George White's diaries. Clarice gets horrors. Janet, sky high. A former CIA official describes how he slipped LSD to a B-girl in a San Francisco bar as recreated here.
I took an ordinary book of matches and a plastic vial that contained the dose. You leaned over her drink with a match. At the moment you struck it, you squeezed the pack. That squirted a liquid. And the sound of the match striking hid the sound of the liquid hitting her drink. It did get to her. It did affect her. She talked about being a little bit nervous. She said she didn't know what the matter was with her. It didn't knock her out. If it did later, I didn't know.
Even if it had, there would have been no way of getting her medical help, for it had to be kept secret. During all of these tests, there was rarely, if ever, medical supervision. As one agency memo says, we have no answer to the moral question. Still another agency source says, if we were scared enough of a drug not to try it on ourselves, we sent it to San Francisco for testing. The safe houses were not the only testing grounds. Millions of dollars would be spent on LSD research at universities throughout the country. And word would begin to spread on campus about this so-called mind-blowing drug. And suddenly, there was the counterculture of the 60s.
It seems to me that it was a sort of elitist drug.
Dr. Sidney Cohen, one of the country's foremost authorities on LSD.
Then, of course, the thing broadened enormously when Tim Leary and the Harvard group spoke so glowingly about the drug.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug. The fallout from that was that the young psychologists began taking it themselves, discovering that it was an intelligence-enhancing, consciousness-raising experience.
The counter case that I would make in relationship to that is to remember that the people who were doing the research were people who would be doing the research regardless of who was the sponsor.
But the more people the CIA helped in LSD research, the more people would be turned on.
I know that some of the studies in which the CIA had supported used as subjects people who later became strong proselytizers of LSD. So, in that sense, yes, I think it did sustain the perpetuation of the use of the drug. And it's rather ironic, isn't it?
I don't think anybody working in that time in the remotest ever thought that it would blow up into the kind of thing that it did.
History will judge the role of the CIA and other intelligence agencies in unwittingly contributing to the counterculture of the 60s through their intense interest in LSD and other hallucinogenics. But for the moment at least, the argument can be made that the CIA helped usher in the age of Aquarius. Covering a span of history such as we are in this report, one can get sidetracked by the so-called glamour and mystery of espionage work. But what you can't lose sight of is what this would all mean in terms of individual human beings. There would be deaths, there would be long-lasting and harmful effects. The best-known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program. Olson left behind a widow, Alice, and 3 children, but it would be years before they learned the real story of his death. Shortly after his suicide, Alice Olson was visited by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who had administered the drug, and by Robert Lashbrook, his deputy, who was the last person with Frank Olson the night of his death.
It was probably to check me out and see whether I was handling myself and handling the situation, whether I was hysterical. And I'm sure they left the house feeling ever so much better because I had been gracious and hospitable to them, so that I must have played right into their hand and made them feel fine.
23 years later, how did you feel about that meeting?
My anger was unbelievable at how I had been duped for this length of time, and the anguish which was unnecessary.
Anyone who knew during all of those years never told Alice Olson the real story of her husband's death. She would discover it by accident more than 2 decades later. In essence, it was a 22-year-long cover-up. Lyman Kirkpatrick was Inspector General of the CIA at the time of Frank Olson's death. Kirkpatrick attempted to have those responsible reprimanded. He wrote a series of letters for the CIA director's signature. In the first he wrote, those responsible had shown exceedingly bad judgment. It was rejected by high agency officials. And 5 drafts later, it was watered down to bad judgment. And those responsible were told they should not consider the letters to be reprimands. But had not the Olson case occurred within the secret confines of the CIA, would not this case have been a prosecutable case? Perhaps
manslaughter? I would think definitely prosecutable, and certainly from the point of view of Mr. Olson, why it should probably have been actionable.
If you had an opportunity to say something to either Sidney Gottlieb or Bob Lashbrook, what would you want to say?
I really don't know. Except to say that I believe that nobody has the power to intercede in people's lives in the way they did.
Frank Olson's suicide slowed down the CIA's testing of LSD and other drugs, but only momentarily. It would soon pick up again, and the guinea pigs were mental patients and prisoners. Here at the Federal Drug Hospital at Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell would test LSD and other drugs on prisoners. And as a reward, they would be given the drug of their addiction. One of them was Eddie Flowers, then a teenage addict. He is now fully recovered and is a director of this Washington, D.C. Drug Rehabilitation Center. That's really Alice in Wonderland. Here you were in a public health facility for drug rehabilitation. You're being given LSD without your knowledge, and as a reward for it, you're getting heroin.
Well, when I look back on it, I get angry.
because the biggest piece of me recognizes that I was used. Okay, that a weakness was capitalized on.
The CIA was not the only government agency interested in the possibilities LSD and other drugs presented for mind control. The Army Chemical Corps first started working with the CIA and then branched off on its own. It too tested drugs on unwitting victims, and a death would result. The case of this man, Harold Blower, a tennis pro, seen here with his daughter Elizabeth, is well known. In 1953, Blower was a private patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was given 5 injections of a mescaline derivative that was being tested secretly for the Army Chemical Corps. With the 5th injection, Harold Blower died. As with the Olson case, a 22-year cover-up followed, until finally the Army admitted the real details of Blower's death. From a previously classified deposition of Dr. James Cattell, who administered the mescaline derivative, on the purpose of the drug testing, to produce symptoms similar to those that you see in schizophrenia, on how much the patient knew about all this. We didn't delineate all the possibilities of what might happen because then you contaminate your experiment. Cattell then relates that he never even knew what drug he had given Harold Blower because of the secrecy of the Army experiments. We didn't know whether it was dog piss. This was secret. This was a secret. We weren't in on it. We asked Blower's daughter Elizabeth for her reaction.
What? How can anybody react to that? I mean, that is so far from what you'd expect from a human being, never mind a doctor, never mind a professional specialist who's supposed to care about people's minds. It's unbelievable.
Other documents strongly suggest that the Army tried to defraud the courts when the Blower family sued. This memo from the Judge Advocate General's office suggests putting all documents relating to the case in the Chemical Corps' procurement center. There, they would be beyond the subpoena power of the plaintiff in this action. This memo, written 6 months after Blower's death, talks of insurance for a proposed contract at Columbia University for similar drug tests, and says these experiments occasionally may result in unavoidable fatality.
And what did it mean to you when you were first apprised of how your father actually did die?
It was worse than losing him in a very strange way.
A suit filed by Elizabeth Barrett against the Army Chemical Corps is now pending in federal court. Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain. The Associated Press reported in 1975 that the chief researcher on the program, Dr. Russell Monroe, said the experiments involved only monkeys and cats, that some researchers had branched out into research of their own on humans, that consent was always given by the patient, and that Tulane never gave the Army any kind of report. These are various progress reports written by Dr. Monroe for the Army and recently obtained by ABC News. We asked Dr. Monroe, now head of the psychiatry department at the University of Maryland, about his remarks to the AP.
I think it's a little bit of a distortion. What I meant by, or what I reported at that time was that we published the data. We would not give the Army the data and let them declare it secret.
From one of the progress reports of Dr. Monroe, a report of a woman who had electrodes implanted in the brain and was then given LSD and other drugs. She became agitated, cried, lapsed into a trance-like state. Felt as if she were about to have a convulsion, experienced waves of darkness and light, had bizarre sensations in her neck and legs, said somebody was trying to manipulate her body. At this point, Dr. Monroe wrote that the woman was obviously having paranoid ideas.